Bonjour et bienvenue à cette conférence de presse. Hello and welcome to this press conference. I'm Elizabeth Thompson with CBC News. With us today, we have MP Peter Julian, MP Heather McPherson, Beatrice Bruske from the Canadian Labour Congress, Catherine Coumans from MiningWatch Canada, and Meg Gingrich from the Steelworkers Union, who will be talking about two bills that Ms. McPherson and Mr. Julian have tabled in the House of Commons. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to everyone for being here with us today. This is an exciting day for all of us. This is a moment in time where two members of the New Democratic Party are able to table human rights legislation that will go a long way to protecting people in Canada and around the world. I want to thank my colleague, Member of Parliament Peter Julian, the member for Westminster Burnaby, for being here today and for tabling his bill 262, the Corporate Responsibility to Protect Human Rights Act. This legislation is a crucial first step to addressing adverse impacts of human rights in reaction to business activities conducted abroad. I was also proud to second this bill this morning in the House of Commons as the NDP critic for Foreign Affairs and International Development. Today, I tabled Bill C-263, the Responsible Business Conduct Abroad Act. And together, these two pieces of legislation aim to increase the accountability for Canadian corporations that violate human rights in Canada and abroad. I have to tell you, as somebody who's been doing this work for many years prior to being a member of Parliament, this moment in time, this opportunity to table this legislation is very important to me. I want to thank all of the activists, all of the Canadians, people around the world who fought to make sure that this legislation could come forward. It's vitally needed, and the decades of effort that so many people have put in accumulates in the legislation that we were able to table today. This legislation is based on a blueprint that was brought forward in 2017 from the Canadian Network on Corporate Accountability. And I want to thank them for their efforts and their work to make sure that Canadian mining companies are held to account overseas. As many of you will know, Canadian mining companies are often registered in Canada, partly because Canada has extremely lax regulations. And so companies, even if they are not actually from Canada, often base their companies in this country. And then when we look at the situation where many countries where mining happens abroad have poor democracies, have weak human rights protections, workers and communities are violated. To address this, in 2018, the Liberal government brought forward the core ombudsperson position. They announced the creation of this independent ombudsperson office and told Canadians that the ombudsperson would have robust powers to investigate allegations of human rights that tied Canadian corporate activity overseas. However, as many of you will know, the Canadian government did not deliver on that promise. The core has been operational for nearly 3 years, and yet the Government of Canada has failed to give the ombudsperson the ability to compel documents, the ability to compel witnesses. To date, 24 inquiries and 23 complaints have been reviewed by the core since its complaint process was launched on March 15th, 2021. However, no admissible complaints have been received by the core. That means that since this was announced in 2018, almost 4 years ago, there have been 0 complaints investigated. There have been 0 complaints referred to arbitration, and there have been 0 complaints determined to be founded or unfounded. In other words, nothing has happened. Clearly, there is a problem here, and this bill that I have tabled today intends to fix that problem. First, it enforces the importance of an independent body with the ability to investigate human rights abuses by Canadian companies operating abroad. And second, it calls for the ability, for the power to compel testimony and witness. a power that was initially promised by the Canadian government but was left out of the Recourse mandate. This bill realizes the promises made in 2018 that Canada needs to deliver upon. Canada must live up to its human rights obligations in Canada and around the world. I'd now like to ask my colleague, Peter Julian, to tell you a little bit about the human rights legislation that he was able to table today in the House of Commons. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Heather. And I wanted to pay tribute to Heather McPherson, the Member of Parliament for Edmonton Strathcona. Her bill C-263 is really going to provide, finally, some impetus for Canada meeting its obligations around human rights abroad. And she's been a fighter for human rights internationally before becoming a member of Parliament, of course, on the Human Rights Subcommittee and now in the Foreign Affairs Committee, is doing an amazing job of raising human rights to the forefront. Her bill will make a difference, there is no doubt. And it is coupled with as part of the NDP tools that we're using to advance human rights, coupled with my bill C-262. And I wanted to pay tribute to the Canadian Network for Corporate Accountability for the models that they have put forward in the last few years that have really served as an inspiration for the bill that we put forward today. Now, what Bill C-262 does, and the short title is the Corporate Responsibility to Protect Human Rights Act, is oblige Canadian corporations operating abroad to do due diligence and ensure that they're meeting the obligations around human rights. It also provides to ensure that corporations that commit these appalling human rights violations, the victims actually have recourse in Canadian court. This is absolutely essential. We have seen Canadian corporations linked to appalling and atrocious violations of human rights. Slavery, torture, murder, systemic sexual violence, all linked to Canadian corporations. And up until now, many of those appalling violations of human rights have occurred with impunity. If the Canadian corporations are not being responsible, often there is no established or independent or non-corrupt judicial and policing system to ensure that the victims actually receive the justice to which they are so deserved of receiving. And so putting into place these two bills really ensures that we are meeting our international human rights obligations. Il faut dire que ces deux projets de loi mis ensemble fait en sorte que le Canada, enfin, va commencer à respecter les droits humains. On a vu des situations absolument déplorables, l'esclavage, la torture, le meurtre et même la violence sexuelle systémique. Et dans tous ces cas, ça est arrivé avec aucun recours aux victimes et aucune justice qui a été rendue. Alors, le projet de loi de Heather McPherson fait en sorte qu'enfin, on a une situation ou un ombudsperson qui peut renforcer les droits des droits humains. Avec mon projet de loi C-262, qui est dans son titre abrégé, s'appelle la loi sur la responsabilité des entreprises de protéger les droits de la personne. On a une obligation de toutes les grandes entreprises canadiennes à respecter les droits humains, de mettre en place des procédures pour respecter les droits humains. Et pour les victimes, ils ont aussi la capacité de poursuivre ces compagnies, ces grandes entreprises canadiennes, s'ils ne respectent pas les droits humains fondamentaux. Respecter les droits humains, respecter les droits des travailleurs et des travailleuses, c'est un principe fondamental au Canada. Il faut maintenant que les grandes entreprises canadiennes respectent eux aussi les droits humains et les droits des travailleurs et des travailleuses, peu importe où ils sont au monde. Alors, on espère bien que les députés et le gouvernement va faire en sorte qu'on puisse mettre en place ces projets de loi et avancer les droits humains à l'échelle internationale. Merci.
Civil society, labor organizations, and impacted communities have been calling for legislative change for years. I'm happy to be joined this afternoon with Dr. Catherine Coumans from MiningWatch Canada. She is also on the steering committee of the Canadian Network for Corporate Accountability. Meg Gingrich, the assistant to the Canadian National Director of United Steelworkers of Canada, and Beatrice Bruske, the president of the Canadian Labour Congress. They are all going to make statements on behalf of their organizations. Dr. Coumans, if I could start with you.
Thank you very much. As we've heard, Canada is a major player in mining with a large global footprint. 730 Canadian mining companies operate in 97 foreign countries, most of which are developing countries. For more than 20 years, MiningWatch Canada has worked in solidarity with communities, Indigenous peoples, and workers struggling with serious abuses such as violent evictions by mine personnel of Indigenous peoples, shootings by mine security of local men and boys, and rapes of women and girls, and the use of forced labor at Canadian mines in places such as Burma, Eritrea, Papua New Guinea, Tanzania, Guatemala, and Mexico, to name but a few. As well, we've dealt with contamination of ground and surface water at nearly all mines where we operate, or where we observe. And sadly, the occurrence of such incidents at Canadian-owned mines is not diminishing. Year after year, the mining industry is expanding its global footprint into ever more remote Indigenous territories, fragile ecosystems, and countries with weak governance. This reality, combined with zero accountability for their activities at home in Canada, has led to effective impunity for Canadian mining companies operating overseas. Impunity which enables further abuses. So what does Canada currently provide to hold our companies to account at home? We have a much critiqued national contact point for the OECD guidelines, which was set up in 2000. MiningWatch Canada has brought 7 cases to the NCP, and none resulted in relief for the people harmed. And since 2019, as we've heard, we have this ombudsperson who, after sustained mining industry lobby, was stripped by the Government of Canada of independence and the necessary investigatory powers that the government had committed to giving her, making her no more useful to communities and workers than the national contact point. Member of Parliament McPherson's bill aims to reform the ombudsperson into an effective accountability tool. Canada has a state duty to protect human rights, and this extends to people harmed by Canadian companies and their subsidiaries overseas. Furthermore, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which was endorsed by Canada, emphasized the right of affected peoples to access remedy in the home country of multinationals. The UN Human Rights Committee noted in regard to Canada that it is, quote, concerned about allegations of human rights abuses by Canadian companies operating abroad, in particular mining corporations, and about the inaccessibility to remedies by victims of such violations, unquote. The committee asked Canada to, quote, develop a legal framework that affords legal remedies to people who have been the victims of activities of such corporations operating abroad. France, unquote. France has already implemented such legislation, and the EU is moving in the same direction. Member of Parliament Peter Julian's bill will create accountability and access to judicial remedy in Canada. To close, I would just like to say that we are all aware of the horrific burden of needless human suffering in the world and the tremendous stress that our natural environment is under. Canadian companies should not be adding to these burdens. It is time for Canada to quit stalling, quit caving to mining industry lobbying, and move to implement the private members' bills that have been tabled today. Thank you.
I would now ask Ms. Gingrich to provide her comments from the United Steelworkers of Canada.
Thank you. The Steelworkers Union is fully supportive of the 2 bills presented today. Together, these bills can form the legislative foundation of a progressive Canadian response to the ongoing challenges of business and human rights, and to a recurring pattern of worker rights violations linked to Canadian companies in their global operations and supply chains. Our union is a mining union. We're convinced mining can create well-paid, safe jobs and make an enormous contribution to economic and equitable social development, both here in Canada and around the world. The transition to a low-carbon economy is creating more opportunities in mining. But the promise of mining will only be realized if human rights, including worker rights and environment, are respected. Too often, this has not been the case. These bills, if passed, will help change that. For example, Canadian mining companies operating in Mexico, where in one case, 4 individuals supporting labor rights have been murdered, those companies will proactively have to ensure labor rights are respected. And if they are not, an ombudsperson with teeth can investigate and make recommendations. Aggrieved workers will be able to come to a Canadian court seeking redress. Or to take another non-mining example, Canadian clothing brands and retailers such as Marks and its owner, Canadian Tire, will proactively have to identify risks of human rights violations in their global garment supply chains and address the obvious injustice of poverty wages in supplier factories in countries such as Bangladesh. MP McPherson's bill offers the Liberal government an opportunity to make good on its 2018 commitment to a human rights ombudsperson with teeth. Steelworkers, together with the CLC, stood shoulder to shoulder with the minister when the core was announced. The Liberal government's subsequent backsliding was deeply troubling. We are excited that there is now legislation in the House that can finally and fully establish the ombuds that workers and communities have been asking for. Institutional investors are increasing their scrutiny and expectations of corporate performance around environment and human rights. Business selling to mass consumer markets, for example, in the tech and auto sectors, are increasingly sensitive to consumer concerns and are turning to their suppliers, demanding transparency and improved supply chain performance. The 2 bills tabled today will help create a level playing field for forward-looking Canadian companies that have already taken steps to improve human rights and environmental performance. And for those companies that are laggards, the bills will be the push they need to adapt to a changing world.
Thank you very much. Ms. Bruske, can I ask you to go next, please?
Thank you. Good morning. It's an absolute privilege to be here at this important juncture in a long-fought cause to address corporate responsibility and to seek remedy for victims of abuse. Time and again, we've witnessed how weaknesses and lapses in Canadian and global economic systems have failed to protect workers from harm. The global pandemic has shone a light on the importance of Canadian trade and supply chains, but it has also exposed the governance gaps that have harmed workers and communities around the globe. In fact, the global pandemic has created new risks to the safety and security of human rights defenders and workers. The Canadian Labour Congress partners with workers around the world who face ongoing severe worker rights violations. Workers are hurt and killed on the job due to health and safety issues. Labor rights activists are harassed, imprisoned, and killed when they try to defend basic worker rights. CLC and allies have been advocating for strong legislation to protect workers and communities impacted by the operation of Canadian companies overseas. We have specifically been calling for an independent ombudsperson with real powers to investigate allegations of human rights abuses in the operation of Canadian companies overseas. And importantly, we've been calling for a law that holds companies to account by requiring that they prevent human rights abuses from happening in the first place. The bills introduced today by MP Peter Julian and MP Heather McPherson hit the right marks, and we celebrate this important step. These bills are essential to building back better for everyone. I want to take a moment to highlight the several elements of the due diligence bill that are particularly important to us, which coincide with key demands of the global labor movement. A strong mandatory human rights due diligence law should focus on human rights, victims' rights, and rights holders. It requires consultation with workers and rights holders and the establishment of an alert mechanism. It helps workers and impacted community members access remedy. Bill C-262, introduced by Peter Julian, requires companies to take steps to stop harm from happening in the first place. This is why the CLC and the steelworkers and the labor movement globally have been calling for comprehensive measures to rein in corporate abuse. This legislation is a real game changer that deserves the support of MPs from all parties. Thank you.
Thank you. Now it's time for questions. C'est le période de questions. For those in the room, if you can go to one of the two microphones to ask your question. And then after the room, we will go to any questions on Zoom. And if you are on Zoom and would like to ask a question, please use the raised hand function. Okay. Jean-Sébastien Cloutier, Radio-Canada.
Bonjour. Peut-être que la question est à M. Julian pour le français. Vous dites qu'il y a de plus en plus de problèmes liés à des entreprises canadiennes, que ça ne s'est pas réduit, que ça a augmenté. Pouvez-vous nous donner des exemples? On a même parlé de gens assassinés parfois. Un exemple qui vous frappe et qui expliquerait pourquoi c'est très important, ce projet de loi-là.
Malheureusement, il y a plusieurs tristes exemples qui sont horrifiques. Quand on parle de violence sexuelle systémique qu'on a vue en Papouasie-Nouvelle-Guinée, quand on parle de torture et le meurtre des militants, des gens qui étaient des environnementalistes ou des gens qui voulaient défendre les droits des travailleurs, des travailleuses assassinés, torturés en Amérique centrale, l'esclavage qu'on a vu en Érythrée, en Afrique. Il y a tellement de cas et c'est quelque chose sur lequel je pense, quand on parle devant des gens, quand on fait des réunions publiques, bien sûr avant la pandémie, les gens sont frappés, les Canadiennes et les Canadiens sont frappés par le fait que nous, on a des principes ici, des droits humains, des droits des travailleurs et des travailleuses. Mais souvent, on a des grandes entreprises canadiennes qui, une fois qu'ils quittent le pays, semblent bafouer tous ces droits humains fondamentaux. C'est ça qui est choquant, bouleversant, je pense, pour plusieurs Canadiens. Et le fait qu'on a eu des gouvernements successifs qui ont refusé de mettre en place des mécanismes, d'utiliser des outils pour que ça cesse, est quelque chose que je pense est resté par la très, très grande majorité des Canadiennes et Canadiens. Alors, il y a plusieurs tristes exemples. Je pense qu'avec ces deux projets de loi, on commence à mettre en place des outils qui vont vraiment faire en sorte que les compagnies canadiennes soient obligés de respecter les droits humains et les droits des travailleurs et travailleuses autant à l'extérieur du pays qu'ils le font ici au Canada.
En sous-question, juste pour comprendre, ces actes-là qui ont lieu à l'étranger, ce ne sont pas nécessairement des Canadiens qui les commettent, ce sont des sous-traitants, des gens qui travaillent pour, par exemple, l'entreprise minière X qui est basée dans l'Ouest canadien, par exemple. C'est ça?
Oui, c'est des compagnies canadiennes et c'est leurs employés parfois. Les gardiens de sécurité d'une compagnie canadienne en Papouasie-Nouvelle-Guinée, c'est un très bon exemple. L'obligation des compagnies canadiennes devrait être autant présente dans leurs opérations à l'extérieur du Canada qu'ils le font, qui sont au Canada. Et c'est ça un principe même que je pense la très, très grande majorité, tous les sondages indiquent, la très grande majorité des Canadiens et Canadiennes adhèrent à ces principes des droits humains et que les compagnies canadiennes devraient respecter ces droits humains, même si c'est des sous-traitants, même si c'est des employés.
Merci. Est-ce que madame parle français? Parlez pas français. Est-ce que j'ai le droit à une dernière question, alors? Non?
Vous avez une collègue en arrière qui aimerait poser une question, mais vous pouvez retourner après.
Hi there, Erica Ibrahim, the Canadian Press. This might be for both MP McPherson and Julian. Do you have any sense of how the Liberal government will react and respond to these bills? And does the recently announced agreement between the two parties, to your mind, factor into bringing these bills forward at this time?
Peter, would you like to start, or would you like me to go ahead?
You go ahead.
Well, thank you very much for the question. I mean, I think realistically, the Liberal government should be ashamed of their actions to date on the core ombudsperson. You know, they ran in 2015 on legislation that would give the ombudsperson the teeth and the ability to compel testimony and compel witness and actually do the job to hold Canadian companies abroad to a standard that I think most Canadians want to see. You know, most Canadians feel that we want to be able to see our name around the world respected. We want to see, you know, that Canadians are fighting for human rights, that we are fighting for environmental care, that we're working together on those shared values of democracy and you know, prosperity for humanity. The Liberal government abandoned that when they folded to the mining lobby and made an ombudsperson that cannot do the job that it needs to do. So I hope their response is to feel some sort of shame for what they brought forward and fix it, to agree to support this legislation, agree to fix the ombudsperson. I can't guarantee that will happen, and I don't think that the supplying confidence motion will be something that will make them act with that ethical framework that they should have initially acted with. But perhaps Peter has something else he could add to that.
Well, Jagmeet Singh's been very clear. The agreement is something that is a starting point, and we're going to continue to push these issues. What we're announcing today is we've done the work for the Liberal government, and we're providing the tools for them in order to put in place a meaningful human rights framework, so that Canadians can no longer have to be profoundly ashamed by the actions of Canadian corporations abroad. So we're doing the work for them. We'll continue to press these issues. And as Heather said so eloquently, this is what the government committed 2 years ago. So we're just saying to them, here are the tools, get it done. And we're going to continue to press for that in the coming weeks and months. You also asked the question whether or not this press conference was planned to coincide after the announcement of the agreement. This has actually been in planning for a number of weeks, so it predates the announcement of the confidence and supply agreement.
Okay, Jean-Sébastien, and then we'll go to the questions on Zoom.
What's your actually, we'll go in French again. Quelle est votre confiance que ce projet de loi soit adopté? Est-ce que l'alliance récente avec le Parti libéral vous amène à être encore plus optimiste?
Qu'est-ce qui me rend optimiste, c'est le fait que les Canadiennes et Canadiens veulent que ces deux projets de loi soient adoptés, que ces principes mêmes sont promus, acceptés par la très grande majorité des Canadiennes et Canadiens. Ce qui me rend confiante aussi, c'est le fait que c'est déjà dans les promesses des libéraux depuis des années. Alors, ils n'ont jamais dit, mais on va avoir une position d'ombudsperson, mais sans aucun pouvoir. Ils n'ont jamais promis ça. Ils n'ont jamais promis de juste laisser faire pour les entreprises canadiennes à l'extérieur. Alors, c'est ces deux éléments-là qui nous rendent confiants. On a fait le travail pour le gouvernement. Depuis des années, ils disent, mais là, il faut qu'on ait un cadre pour les droits humains. Là, on a fait le travail et on va pousser dans les semaines et les mois à venir pour que les gouvernements mettent en place ces outils-là qui vont être si importants pour le respect des droits humains à l'extérieur du Canada.
Okay, now we go to the questions on Zoom. Palak Mangat from Politics Today.
Hi, thanks for taking our questions. My first one is for Ms. Gingrich, and sorry if I mispronounce your name. You referenced Canadian companies like Marks, or I believe it was Canadian Tire, sort of being proactively required to identify any risks and the possibility of their supply chains, I guess, being tainted with forced labor and things like that. Can you elaborate on that, you know, how you envision that move to really shift the onus onto companies could take place, and essentially what the enforcement regime could look like from the federal perspective?
Well, I mean, I think right now it's totally, there's nothing that's really binding. So anything that would, you know, force a company to actually demonstrate that they're doing and identifying the risks. I can't get into the details in terms of exactly how a company would go about that. But I think, you know, the bill will set out some of the procedures and obligations in order to comply with it. And so right now, I mean, our main concern is, you know, there have been, we've been very involved in working with workers in Bangladesh. And I think that, you know, people are very, very aware of some of the issues there in factories and in terms of and wages and things like that. So it is up to the companies that operate in Canada, whether or not they have subsidiaries, to sort of identify these things, and how they do that will be set out in the bill to some extent. And then again, as we've said, providing an even playing field, so something for all companies. So if they are already doing it, they can demonstrate that. We don't always know because right now it's just not clear. But being able to demonstrate that and show that they're actually doing that. And I don't know if Catherine or anyone else has any more sort of in the sort of details that they want to elaborate on with that. But you can if you have anything to add.
Sure. I'll just add that, as I think I mentioned, this mandatory human rights due diligence bill that MP Julian has put forward is not something we've just come up with here in Canada. France has already passed such a bill. The EU is moving in this direction. Other countries like the Netherlands and Germany are moving in this direction as well. In France, where they have the most experience with this, it's still very interesting to see that when companies do their yearly reports, in which they're supposed to identify all of the human rights risks that their company and their subsidiaries and contractors are potentially imposing on workers, the environment, and communities, they're supposed to report on those risks yearly and how they've mitigated those risks or tried to avoid those risks. And in France, the companies haven't quite gotten it yet. They're often reporting on the risks to them, to their operations. But that's changing with every year that goes by. This is going to be a learning curve for companies for sure, but just to have public reports that companies will have to fill out, in which they've actually been forced to think about the risks that they may be imposing on people around the world and environments and workers, will be a game changer, because suddenly the companies have to have people in place to actually think about how are we impacting people around the world, and then they have to report on that. But the other part of the bill that is equally important is that if the harm continues, for the first time, people around the world will be able to bring their complaints to Canadian courts and have access to Canadian courts. So at that point, a company that's smart will be able to point to their due diligence procedures and reports and say, look, we tried to address these issues, but if those reports are weak, or it's clear that they haven't tried to address those issues, it's not going to help them a lot when they go to court. So for the first time, I mean, it's not that it's impossible right now for people around the world to come to Canadian courts. There's a few court cases against Canadian mining companies right now, but it's very, very difficult. It has to be something like slave labor in Eritrea before the courts in Canada will hear it. So this will create legislation that will open our courts up. And anyone who is harmed by the Canadian company or a subsidiary or a contractor of a Canadian company can come to Canada to have their day in court. So that's a game changer.
May I have a follow-up?
Yep.
Yeah, so this question I think might be for Ms. McPherson or Mr. Julian if he wants to chime in as well. Ms. McPherson, I know you were at committee yesterday, and we know that the government is looking at bringing in legislation eventually to eradicate forced labor from the supply chain. I know that we don't have a lot of details, but there was a bit of talk around a presumptive ban at that committee. There's also some efforts I know from Liberal backbenchers around this space. Can you maybe speak to the impact this kind of bill could have, I guess, around Canada's role in the international markets? What are the rules you think might need to be tweaked? And essentially, if you anticipate the Liberals pointing to Mr. O'Regan's mandate letter as sort of enough to address this concern.
Well, thank you for the question. Yes, it was an interesting committee meeting yesterday. We found yesterday during the Foreign Affairs Committee that Canada really has done very, very little to stop the importation of goods produced with slave labor from the Xinjiang region of China, where, of course, there's a genocide happening against the Uyghur people. So we clearly need further legislation in place, because what we heard from testimony, from government official testimony yesterday, is that the government has stopped one shipping of cotton, one shipment, in the entire time that we have had the understanding of what is happening in Xinjiang. So obviously there needs to be more legislation coming forward. We did see it in the minister's mandate letter. However, I have very little faith that the government will bring forward what is sufficient, and that they will bring it forward in a manner that is as urgent as is required. So it is vital that we have bills like MP Julian's bill to bring this forward, and to get the government moving on this, to push them to start doing the right thing, because they are dragging their feet. And what happens when they drag their feet is that lives are lost. People are suffering around the world. This is an urgent matter, and it is not being dealt with that way by the government. Peter, did you want to add to that?
No, that was a great answer.
Thanks.
Any other questions? Don't see any, so that ends this press conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Merci beaucoup.